They said it was suicide. But when I opened him up, I found marks that told a completely different story. What I discovered that night didn't just solve a murder, it made me question everything I thought I knew about death itself. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Trust me, you'll want to stay until the end, because what happened in that autopsy room still gives me chills. I'm Dr. Dre Thompson, and I've been cutting open dead bodies for 18 years at the County Medical Examiner's office here in Atlanta. In all that time, I thought I'd seen every possible way a person could die. I was dead wrong. It was a cold Tuesday night in December when they brought in Jake Rodriguez, a 32-year-old social worker from Midtown. His neighbor found him hanging in his bathroom after his coworkers started asking why he hadn't shown up for 4 days straight. The cops took one look at the scene and called it obvious. Another sad case of a guy who couldn't handle his problems anymore. Just got passed over for a promotion at work, and his doctor had him on antidepressants. His ex-wife told police he'd been talking about giving up for weeks. His therapist confirmed he'd been spiraling, missing appointments, not taking care of himself. Everything pointed to suicide. Case closed. But here's the thing about being a medical examiner. Nothing's ever as simple as it looks. The body came in around 9 a.m. on a Wednesday, but I was drowning in cases from a violent weekend. 3 gang shootings, a house fire with 2 victims, and a car accident that killed an entire family. By the time I got Jake, it was past 7 p.m., and the building was practically empty. Just me, the night security guard making his rounds, and the steady hum of the air conditioning that never seemed to shut off. I actually prefer working these late shifts. No interruptions, no phone calls from detectives asking for quick answers, no administrators breathing down my neck about case numbers. Just me and whatever story the dead body wants to tell me. And let me tell you, they always have a story. The autopsy bay felt different that night, though I couldn't put my finger on why. Maybe it was the way the fluorescent light seemed dimmer than usual, or how every small sound echoed louder in the empty building. I'd worked alone countless times before, but something about this particular evening felt off from the moment I walked in. I started with the outside examination like always, taking photos from every angle, measuring everything twice. The rope mark around Jake's neck looks right for a hanging. That upside-down V shape you see when someone uses their shower rod. His face was purple from the blood pooling, eyes all bloodshot with those tiny burst blood vessels you get when someone can't breathe. But then I looked at his hands and something felt wrong. When people hang themselves, they panic at the last second. It's pure instinct. They claw at whatever's choking them, leave scratch marks on their neck, break their fingernails trying to get free. I've seen victims tear their own skin trying to get that rope off. Mike's hands were spotless. Not a single scratch. Not one broken nail. His fingers looked like he'd just gotten them professionally cleaned. I held his hands under the examination light, turning them over, looking for any sign that he'd fought for his life. Nothing. Even his cuticles were perfect. This was a man who supposedly struggled against a rope around his neck, but his hands told a different story entirely. What would you do if you found something like this? Would you trust your gut or go with the obvious answer? I made detailed notes about the hands and kept going, but that little voice in my head, the one that's kept me sharp in this job for nearly 2 decades, was starting to whisper that something wasn't right. Before moving to the internal examination, I spent extra time checking Jake's clothing. He was wearing his best outfit, pressed dark jeans, a clean button-down shirt that still had crisp fold lines from the package, and leather shoes that were freshly polished. Even his belt was expensive, genuine leather with a silver buckle that caught the light. This wasn't the outfit of a man who'd given up on life. This was someone who'd dressed up for something important. The recording equipment clicked on at 8:23 p.m. as I made the first cut. Standard procedure. Everything documented for legal purposes. The Y incision revealed organs that looked surprisingly healthy for someone who'd supposedly been depressed and neglecting himself. Jake's heart looked normal. Lungs were clear and pink. Liver showed no signs of alcohol abuse. But as I worked, more weird details started piling up. His stomach was full of what looked like an expensive dinner. I could identify chunks of steak, asparagus, and what seemed like some kind of fancy potato dish. The food was still barely digested, maybe 2 hours old at most. Who orders a prime rib dinner before killing themselves? And the smell that hit me when I opened his stomach wasn't the usual sour stench I was used to. It was almost pleasant, like he'd been eating at some upscale restaurant. I took samples of the stomach contents for analysis, wondering if maybe he'd been drugged. But the preliminary tests I could run immediately showed no signs of anything unusual. No alcohol, no illegal drugs, just his prescribed antidepressant at normal therapeutic levels. The temperature in the room started feeling weird too. I glanced at the digital thermostat on the wall, still reading 66 degrees, but I was getting goosebumps on my arms. The air felt heavier somehow, like right before a thunderstorm hits. I checked the weather on my phone, but the forecast showed clear skies all week. The fluorescent lights above started flickering, just enough to be annoying, casting this moving shadow across Jake's pale skin. I made a mental note to call maintenance in the morning, but for now, I had work to finish. That's when I heard it. This soft tapping sound, like someone drumming their fingers on a desk. Rhythmic, deliberate, coming from somewhere in the walls. But there was nobody else in the building, except Frank, doing his security rounds. And he was supposed to be down in the parking garage checking cars. Tap, tap, tap. I paused in my work and listened carefully. The sound stopped. I went back to examining Jake's internal organs, carefully removing his heart to check for any signs of disease. It was then that the tapping started again. But this time it seemed to be coming from a different location. Not random anymore, but like it was trying to communicate something. I tried to ignore it and focus on the heart tissue, but the sound was getting under my skin. In 18 years of doing this job, I'd never been spooked by working alone at night. Dead bodies don't scare me. Living people are far more dangerous. But something about that persistent tapping was making me jumpy. When I moved to examine Jake's neck more closely, I made a discovery that changed everything. Under the microscope, the rope mark wasn't just one clean line. There were multiple impressions in the tissue, layered on top of each other like someone had applied pressure, released it, then applied it again, several times. People don't practice hanging themselves. When someone decides to end their life this way, they do it once. These marks told the story of repeated strangulation, someone being choked and revived multiple times before the final application that killed them. That's when I knew for sure. Jake Rodriguez didn't kill himself. Someone tortured him first, then murdered him, and made it look like suicide. But the night was about to get much stranger. The tapping sounds were evolving, becoming more complex. Not just one rhythm anymore, but what sounded like two different patterns, having a conversation. One series of taps from the wall behind me, answered by a different pattern from somewhere near the ceiling. I found myself listening to these exchanges instead of focusing on my work, trying to decode some meaning from their interaction. I was examining Jake's fingernails when I found something that made my hands shake. Hidden under the nail of his right index finger was this tiny fragment of what looked like human skin. It was barely visible to the naked eye, but under the microscope I could see it clearly. Organic tissue that definitely didn't belong to Jake. The cellular structure was different. The pigmentation didn't match. Someone else's DNA was literally embedded under his fingernail. Jake had fought back against his attacker, managed to scratch them hard enough to tear off a piece of their skin. This was the evidence that could identify his killer. I carefully extracted the fragment and prepared it for DNA analysis, though I knew the results wouldn't be available for several days. But the discovery had given me new energy to keep looking for more evidence that the initial investigation had missed. That's when all the lights went out. Complete darkness for what felt like minutes but was probably only 10 seconds. In that black void, with just me and Jake's body and the sound of my heart hammering in my chest, I could hear those tapping sounds getting louder, more insistent. When the emergency lighting finally kicked in, everything felt different somehow. The shadows were deeper, the air felt thicker, and I could swear I heard whispering. Not just one voice, but several, all talking at once, just below the threshold of understanding. The voices seemed to be coming from right next to the examination table, like invisible people were standing there watching me work. I even caught myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone behind me. The rational part of my mind knew it was probably just the building's ventilation system making noise, maybe some kind of pressure change that was affecting my hearing. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was trying to communicate with me, trying to help me understand what had really happened to Jake Rodriguez. I decided to call Detective Ray Martinez, the investigating officer on the case. Ray was a good cop, thorough and experienced, someone I'd worked with on dozens of cases over the years. He listened to my preliminary findings without interrupting, asked several pointed questions about the evidence. "Are you telling me this wasn't a suicide?" Ray asked. "I'm saying the physical evidence doesn't support that conclusion," I replied. "The multiple ligature marks, the absence of defensive injuries on his hands, the condition of his clothing, the expensive meal in his stomach, none of it fits the typical pattern we see in hanging suicides." Ray was quiet for a moment, probably thinking about all the paperwork that would be involved in reopening the case. "The scene was clean, Doc. No signs of struggle. No evidence of forced entry into his apartment. If someone killed this guy, they knew exactly what they were doing." "That's what worries me," I said. "This looks like the work of someone with knowledge of forensic investigation. Someone who knew how to stage a scene to fool both the cops and the medical examiner." Ray agreed to have the crime scene team take another look at Jake's apartment. Maybe bring in some luminol to check for cleaned up blood evidence. But as I hung up the phone, I realized that my examination was far from over. The physical evidence was telling a story that contradicted the official narrative, and I needed to document every detail if we were going to build a case for homicide. The whispering sounds were getting stronger as I returned to the examination table. Not random noise anymore, but what sounded almost like conversations happening just outside my range of hearing. Multiple voices, some high, some low, all speaking in urgent tones about something I couldn't quite make out. I continued my examination, focusing on Jake's internal organs for any additional evidence of trauma. That's when I found something that made me stop cold. The blood pooling patterns in his body were all wrong for someone who'd been hanging. When a person dies by hanging, gravity pulls the blood down to the lowest parts of the body, usually the feet and hands. The blood settles there, creating distinctive purple discoloration called livor mortis. But Jake's blood pooling was consistent, with someone who'd been lying flat on their back for several hours after death. His killer had moved the body, staged the hanging scene sometime later. This was getting more complex by the minute. Not just a murder disguised as suicide, but a carefully planned operation that involved moving the victim's body and creating an elaborate crime scene. Whoever did this had serious knowledge of forensic science and police procedure. I was photographing the blood pooling patterns when I heard footsteps in the hallway outside the autopsy suite. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to pause right outside the door. I called out, thinking maybe Frank was doing his rounds, but got no response. The footsteps continued down the hallway and faded away. A few minutes later, I heard them again. Same rhythm, same pace, but this time going in the opposite direction. I walked to the door and looked out into the empty corridor. Nothing, just the dim emergency lighting and the familiar hum of the building's mechanical systems. But when I returned to the examination table, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Jake's eyes were open. I knew I had closed them earlier, as part of the standard procedure. You always close the victim's eyes before beginning the internal examination. It's basic respect for the deceased, and makes the work easier psychologically. But now his eyes were wide open, staring directly at the ceiling, with an expression that looked almost grateful. I reached over and closed his eyes again, telling myself it was probably just muscle relaxation causing the eyelids to open. It happens sometimes, especially in cases where the victim died from asphyxiation. Nothing supernatural about it. But 5 minutes later, when I looked up from my notes, his eyes were open again. This time I left them alone. The DNA analysis of the tissue fragment came back 3 days later with a hit that blew the case wide open. The skin cells belonged to a man named Tony Castillo, a 38-year-old former military contractor with a history of violence and connections to several unsolved homicides across 4 different states. Ray's investigation revealed that Tony had been in Atlanta during the exact time period when Jake died. Credit card records showed him checking into a downtown hotel 2 days before the murder and checking out the morning after Jake's body was discovered. Security footage from a gas station near Jake's apartment showed Tony's rental car in the area on the night of the killing. But when Ray's team went to arrest Tony, they found him dead in that same hotel room, apparently from a heroin overdose. Except Tony had no history of drug use, had been clean and sober for over 10 years according to his military records. The scene was staged just as carefully as Jake's supposed suicide. The investigation kept expanding as Ray and his team dug deeper into Tony's background. They discovered that he'd been hired through a series of anonymous payments made through cryptocurrency and shell companies. Professional killer for hire, someone who specialized in making murders look like accidents or suicides. But Tony wasn't just responsible for Jake's death. The investigation eventually connected him to 3 other recent suicides in the Atlanta area over the past 8 months. All men in their 30s, all going through personal or financial difficulties that made suicide seem plausible to the initial investigators. When Ray re-examined these cases with fresh eyes, he found the same subtle inconsistencies I'd discovered in Jake's autopsy. Clean fingernails, where defensive injuries should have been present, unusual blood pooling patterns, clothing that was too neat for someone who had supposedly struggled against a ligature. All 4 deaths had been carefully orchestrated homicides. The real break in the case came when Ray's financial crimes unit traced the payments back to their source. All 4 victims had been involved in a complex embezzlement scheme at their workplace, a major accounting firm that handled investments for wealthy clients. Over 2 years, they'd managed to steal nearly $3 million, thinking their computer skills would keep them safe from detection. But someone had figured out what they were doing. Instead of going to the police or the FBI, this person decided to take justice into their own hands. They hired Tony Castillo to eliminate the thieves, one by one, making their deaths look like suicides, brought on by guilt and shame over their crimes. The mastermind behind the killings was never identified. Tony had been eliminated to tie up loose ends, and the financial trail disappeared into a maze of offshore accounts and cryptocurrency wallets that even the FBI's best analysts couldn't penetrate. Whoever ordered these deaths had the resources and technical knowledge to cover their tracks completely. Ray's investigation officially closed the case as a series of homicides committed by Tony Castillo, who had subsequently died of an apparent drug overdose. But we both knew the real killer was still out there somewhere, someone with enough money and connections to orchestrate such an elaborate revenge scheme and then vanish without leaving a trace. What disturbed me most about the case wasn't just the calculated nature of the murders, or even the fact that they'd almost gotten away with it. It was the realization of how easily these deaths could have gone undetected permanently. If I hadn't been thorough enough during Jake's autopsy, if I hadn't noticed those subtle inconsistencies and been willing to dig deeper, 4 murders would have remained classified as suicides forever. Have you ever had a gut feeling that something was wrong, even when everyone else said it was fine? Tell me about it in the comments. The experience fundamentally changed how I approach every case that comes through our facility. Now I look harder at the details that don't make obvious sense, ask more questions when things seem too straightforward, spend extra time on cases that appear routine on the surface. I've discovered 5 more staged suicides since then. Caught 5 more killers who thought they were smarter than the evidence. But what really haunts me about that night in the autopsy suite isn't the forensic discoveries or the criminal investigation that followed. It's the memory of those sounds, the tapping, the whispering, the footsteps in the hallway, the feeling that unseen presences were watching me work and guiding me toward the truth. I've performed hundreds of autopsies since then, spent countless nights alone in that same room. But nothing like that has ever happened again. The rational part of my mind insists it was just stress and fatigue playing tricks on my senses, my subconscious picking up on subtle clues and manifesting them as auditory hallucinations that helped me focus on the evidence I needed to find. But I can't forget the way Jake's eyes kept opening, or how those whispered conversations seemed to grow more urgent whenever I discovered something important. Sometimes, late at night when I'm working alone, I catch myself listening for those sounds again, hoping that whatever presence was in that room might return to help with another difficult case. Maybe it was just my imagination working overtime on a particularly disturbing case. Or maybe Jake Rodriguez really was trying to tell me his story, make sure his murder didn't go unpunished, ensure that his killer didn't get away with a perfect crime. I honestly don't know which explanation scares me more. What I do know is that the dead have stories to tell, and sometimes those stories are the only thing standing between justice and a perfectly planned murder. My job is to listen to those stories, no matter how they choose to communicate them, through physical evidence, forensic analysis, or whispered conversations that seem to come from thin air. Because in the end, that's what forensic pathology is really about. Giving voice to those who can no longer speak for themselves, making sure their final testimony is heard by those who have the power to seek justice on their behalf, even when that testimony comes in ways that challenge everything you thought you knew about life, death, and the thin line between them. What do you think was really happening in that autopsy room that night? Do you believe the dead can communicate with the living? Let me know your thoughts below. And don't forget to subscribe for more true crime stories that will keep you up at night. Trust me, Jake Rodriguez's case was just the beginning of some truly disturbing discoveries I've made over the years. Thank you all for being a part of these journeys with me. Your continued support truly means the world, and I absolutely enjoy reading your comments, especially when you share your own experiences and reactions. If these tales had you holding your breath or sent a chill down your spine, don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe for more eerie and unsettling stories. Have you ever gone through something similar, or do you have your own mysterious encounter to share? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to read it. Every story you share helps deepen the connection in our growing community of horror lovers. There's more to come, so stay close for more chilling tales. And remember, the most terrifying stories are often the ones that feel a little too real. Thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.